A very pleasant morning to all. A good teacher can inspire hope, ignite the imagination, and instill a love of learning. With this beautiful note, I begin my session today. I am Devi. I will be a host for the today's faculty development program. I take this as my honor to invite our dear Principal Madam, Professor Dr. Gauri Ramesh, to deliver the welcome address. Madam, over to you. Ma'am, am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you are audible. Ma'am got struck. That is a
Ma'am,
technical glitch. Ma'am, there is a technical glitch to our principal, ma'am. So you can proceed, ma'am.
yes. Sorry for the technical snag. Let me have an immense pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Professor Padmavati Manchikanti. Yes, I take the privilege in welcoming our speaker of the session, respected Professor Dr. Padmavati Manchikanti, Professor Rajiv Gandhi School of Intellectual Property Law, IIT Kharagpur, West Bengal. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker to you all. Ma'am is a trained expert in IP, familiar with various aspects of IP, specifically patents, patent search, mapping and landscapes, drafting of patents, invention disclosure filing, and also imparted training in specific aspects of IP teaching. She has taught many subjects, including law of patent, IP management and technology transfer, and other forms of IP law, biodiversity law, traditional knowledge protection research. Ma'am did her master's in intellectual property and biotechnology and secured PhD in plant science. She has held various positions during her career. She was the former dean of Rajiv Gandhi School of Intellectual Property Law, assistant professor and associate professor in Rajiv Gandhi School of Intellectual Property Law, IIT Kharagpur. She was also the associate faculty at School of Energy Sciences, IIT Kharagpur, and more specifically, Ma'am was the senior scientist in Monsanto Research Center, Bangalore. Ma'am is a recipient of various awards. In the year 2009, she has received Microsoft Outstanding Young Faculty Award in IP. Ma'am has undertaken many research projects since the year 2005, and few are building awareness on IP rights for Ministry of Micro, Small, Medium Enterprises, IP Facilitation Center, Government of India, Herbal biodegradable therapeutic dressing for traumatic wound care, Department of Science and Technology, Government of India. Development of the e-commerce strategy plan for Ethiopia Grail Consultancy Services. Bioactive peptide synthesis from honey protein and its characterization, Council of Scientific and Industrial Research, Government of India. Plant Metabolic Pathways Laboratory, Ministry of Human Resource Development, Government of India, and many more on the line. Ma'am's field of expertise includes intellectual property, biodiversity, and plant microbiology. Needless to mention that ma'am has published and presented many papers in various renowned national and international journals in the field of IP laws. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome ma'am to deliver her lecture on interdisciplinary approach to IP law teaching. Welcome, ma'am. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Devi, for this kind introduction. Good morning, Professor Gauri, participants of the uh, workshop, the faculty from your institution. It is a pleasure to be back with all of you. Without taking much time, let me quickly share my presentation with all of you, and then we will get started. I hope you're able to see my presentation.
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. It's a pleasure to speak to this forum on the faculty development program on the interdisciplinary approach to IP law teaching. Yes, I think it's been a long journey for me as a IP law teacher. So I'd be also sharing some insights into the experience that I have gained over a couple of years. So let me set the tone for the presentation today. Uh, on the interdisciplinary areas of general teaching, we find that there is a need to understand the expectations of such kind of a teaching. So when we look at it from an institutional end, there are aspects that we need to consider from the basic subject discipline as well as from the interface areas of that subject with the related subjects. So it is not that interdisciplinary teaching was not inculcated into curricula of different institutions. We already have that in the area of science and technology. And we do see that growing in the area of law as well. But in the recent times, I can tell you, more than a decade or so, we've seen rapid changes in the technology, and the space of technology growth has necessitated a relook at the existing legal paradigm. So therefore, it is not just for the people who are implementing the law, but also when you really look at it from capacity building in dealing with the interdisciplinary areas of technology and law, we need a lot of faculty to be building capacity in that particular area. Now, IP law is one such interdisciplinary area. You do see a lot of interdisciplinary areas like cyber law. You are much aware the growth of IT law in the current, and then again in that you're having specific disciplines like telecommunication law, energy law is growing like anything. Then you see the interfaces of many other disciplines which are happening in the last decade as we see. I will limit my experience to teaching of IP law. Now, why is teaching of IP law highly interdisciplinary in nature? Because in IP law, there are subjects which are in the interface of technology and law. So here we are looking at the aspect of dealing with a discipline which comes in the intersect of the technology aspects and then the application of the law. And that is why it's quite challenging if you look at teaching in the area of intellectual property law. As teachers who have been involved in long years of teaching, you will all agree with me that we have moved from the traditional teaching of law to where we are needing to inculcate the current paradigm. Also looking at what are the outcomes that we need to deal with. So today, we not only need to understand how to build the capacity in IP teaching, but we also need to appreciate the need for effective outcomes. So IP teaching has to have a direct impact on the outcomes that we see in relation to teaching. And a little later from now, I'll deal with how do we address these aspects. So let me take up the first aspect of it in terms of building capacity in IP teaching. From the background that I can understand in legal research, we never had teachers who were specifically trained in IP law. It was general law teachers who migrated into the teaching of IP or picked up the interest in teaching for IP because of the need for IP education. And then there was also a scenario where we looked at augmenting or supplementing teachers from practice. So here we are looking at incorporating into the academic fold people from industry, organizations, and the judiciary to build in the understanding of the practical context of the law. Soon, the need to drive a specific set of teachers who can handle both the general teaching of IP in the academic context and also be able to build the practical context in the same classroom has become the need of the hour. So this is where we look at the interdisciplinarity of teaching some of the subjects in law. Now, especially IP, if you look at, here you have matters of fact and matters of law. So unless you understand the matters of fact, the application of the law is not going to be sound. So therefore, subjects like patents are dealing with technologies from different areas. Now you look at the aspect of IT law. Then you look at the aspect of biodiversity law. Someone who does not understand biodiversity context will not be able to effectively apply the understanding of law to this subject. And then of course we have the other areas of where, like for instance, you're looking at IP management. This requires someone who understands not just the law, but also how to deal with the law from the point of view of managing assets for a company, managing the IP portfolio of a company, strategizing in relation to IP. So IP is no longer a straitjacketed thing of studying just the substantive law and the procedural law. It is also about understanding core leave and IP strategy. So I'll give you a little detail into how do we approach this wider range of subjects. So even in the interdisciplinarity within IP, you still have so much of complexity. When you look at even just a small set of subjects, not to discriminate with other areas of IP, the area of copyright is becoming much more important than patents to some extent. So the traditional teaching of copyright now has moved into the aspect of understanding of digital copyrights. Now in the digital copyrights, how the entertainment industry has difficulties in dealing with copyright issues. What are the copyright issues in the digital for? And today you're seeing the range of issues that we see from the implementation of such laws. So it is just not technology specific subjects, but even if you look at the simpler forms of intellectual property rights, there also you see the complexity growing. So therefore, I would believe that the entire range of intellectual property teaching is just not about these subjects, but other subjects as well. And then we have this interface of, let us say, intellectual property and competition law. A lot of cases are coming up in that area. So one needs to understand competition law, and one needs to also appreciate where the interface between competition law and IP law is coming up. So you require a teacher who is teaching that subject would need to understand IP, would also need to understand competition law, because then you will be able to understand how to bring the interface understanding to your students. So yes, sir. So you would appreciate that it is getting complex by the day. And with new technologies, it ought to be even more complex, I would believe, when we talk about teaching a subject like AI to law students, the impact of AI. So you are having, specific subjects when we see, these kind of subjects coming up. Now let me move into the understanding of how do we go about building the capacity on IP. And the first and the foremost is understanding your stakeholder. Who is your stakeholder? Are your stakeholders graduate students? Are your stakeholders master students? Are your stakeholders PhD students? Because increasingly PhD students have the coursework that they need to do. Or even are your stakeholders, let us say, junior faculty of an institution? So understanding the stakeholder requirements are very important. But of course, as you all would agree with me, students are the largest group that we all deal with day in and day out. And today the student group is no longer homogeneous, it is heterogeneous. For instance, I have a student class which has a bunch of engineers and then some from science, one who is a doctor. Now, how do you really cater to intellectual property teaching to this entire set of students? If you teach too much of pharmaceutical area in relation to patents, the engineers would get bored. But the area of patents is ridden day in and day out with cases only from the pharmaceutical area. So how do you gently balance the understanding so that all of them are in class? This is a big challenge to the teacher. So therefore, IP teaching is quite a daunting task, I must say, if you're looking at diverse disciplines, teaching people with diverse disciplines. So therefore, traditionally, if you look at defining curriculum for such kind of IP teaching, it is no longer in the straitjacketed way in which we look at doling out the modules. So here we need to look at there are certain general modules, and then from after the general modules, there are specific modules which are taken up only for those specific set of students from each discipline. Now, what is the idea behind all of that? That we need to look at how can we add IP teaching to the core background. So typically when we go into such kind of teaching, if you're teaching, let us say a mechanical engineer who is coming from a mechanical engineering background need to have a sound understanding of the patterns from that area. So that is the primary requirement. And then because of the need for outcomes where we are looking at their career growth, then an alternate area is something that they can also start picking up. So therefore, someone who is a mechanical engineer by way of background need to be good in that area, and also then take up the allied discipline of maybe electrical or some other area where you're building your additional interest. So teaching is no longer the typical 2 credit means 30 hours, 3 credits means 40 hours. Actually, a teacher needs to go much beyond all of it. And all of you would appreciate that the online, though has facilitated a lot of this kind of background teacher-student discussion, but it also still has challenges. So fundamentally, we need to look at, are there 2 things that we need to look at are, do we need prerequisites? Because if you're looking at a homogeneous class, that's not a problem. But if you're looking at a heterogeneous class, do we need prerequisites? That is something that we need to consider. Then students come from different organizations. Student institutions are varied. So if you need to bring them to an average understanding, then the question of having prerequisite is an important aspect. The second thing that we need to look at is, how does the teaching learning methodology help in building capacity? So this is where the credit load is a understanding is important. So for instance, let me pick up a subject that I've been teaching since many years now, patent law. Here you're looking at the substantive understanding, the procedural aspects, typically, and then of course the extended aspects of looking at prosecution by way of procedure, then strategy. So this subject is bringing this into a credit system is a big challenge. And I can tell you, I've never been feeling easy with doing this subject because there's always something new to add. There's so much changing day by day that you need to bring that into the class. Now today, the practice that is coming into India is coming from different jurisdictions, which means students need to be also exposed to comparative law. That means the credit load is just not enough. But then you have to look at the effective outcomes. Remember the 2 questions that we started with. The effective outcome for a student is what? Not just understanding the Indian patent law, the Patents Act 1970, but also be able to understand cross-jurisdiction practice. So this is a challenge. The second thing is skill development. So is the class oriented more towards information package, that is you're doling out what is the substantive law? It is more of a monologue. But are you also reflecting on the skill development? That is, are students also exposed to the general understanding of how IP filing is done? Do they interact with the IP cells? Do they visit the IP office? And of course, in this, I would also include to a large extent even the internships. Students do learn a lot on internships. Does our teaching help in critical thinking? So are students exposed to enough exercises? I remember traditionally, even in the area of technology, we were given a lot of assignments. Those days, well, there used to be a stretch at which we used to work, but still, I think largely people used to be doing a lot of assignments per month. Today, in the digital world that we live in, that practice of writing a lot has come down, even in our students. I'm talking about the current generation of students. So how do we encourage them to write more and more? Today, if they cannot write 5 pages, tomorrow if they're going to be a judge, can they write a 60-page judgment? This is a question that we need to address, and it's not easy. I can tell you that. How many moot courts? Because moot court is essentially another exercise that is inherent in the law schools. So which not only looks at the communication skill, but also building the argumentative aspect of the legal, in the legal fore. How rational are they in their thinking? How are they able to apply the law? And today we are also looking at newer trends. Because we need to augment a lot of skill learning, do we need a lab, a law lab? So that the teacher can now take that part of the extra load into the lab. And world over, this is not something which is new. It is already happening. Cooperative teaching has already been there, but how do we build cooperative teaching in the area of IP law? So here we look at the aspect of, for a teacher to be teaching such kind of subjects, the need to balance the general understanding with the specific understanding becomes very important. And as all of you would agree with me, fundamentals need to be strong. So while we are harping on the fundamentals, we also need to gently build that subject specific or the practice specific knowledge into the teaching. So a teacher is, I would believe, the greatest experimenter in this area. I would believe that. So we have, how do we go about this kind of, in an institutional context? So beginning with the concept-based learning, more and more practical understanding into the subject needs to be built. So you may have group exercises, because if you're having a student strength of 40 or 30, an individual attention is possible. But anywhere, if you're having student strength beyond 40, it's difficult to do on an individual end, because the teacher is all the time only evaluating, and the evaluation becomes more of a routine and doesn't add any value. So therefore, group learning can be a very important way of doing things. I would really be surprised to know how many workbooks do we have in legal teaching. This is typically in the area of science, you see a lot of workbooks being developed, because of course that is more of experimental science, but law is no different. Science is a very logical subject. Law is also a very logical subject. So can we have workbooks so that it eases out on the burden on the teacher, and in the beginning of the semester, you can give them a workbook. A workbook is typically a set of exercises, running exercises of, let's say, 20, 30, in which there are some model answers also given, or maybe a few of them. So the student has the comfort of taking this back home and solving the workbook by the end of the semester. This may help in actually strengthening teaching. Of course, case study methods are available. Internship, we discussed about, that is one important mode. I do see student requests coming of internships beyond 2 months, beyond 3 months, because they want to have a greater interaction with law firms. Well, if some of the institutions do not have a straight-jacketed thing, it's possible, but many institutions have very rigid timelines. Then the student has not much adequate time to complete the internships. By the time the student goes into internships and settles in, he or she is out of it. So this is something that we also experimented with, where since the time on internship was less, we said that we'll take forward the internship work into a student semester project. So the internship completes, and in the internship, there are some actually critical issues which are raised during the internship, which due to the lack of time, the intern could not take it forward. So for a very effective outcome of an internship, we moved that into what we call a semester project for the student, so that that work can complete with either the law firm or the industry. So the end result of that entire thing with respect to building capacity should be, students should be able to learn more in the institution. Today, all of us know that the moment we wake up and we want to know something, Google has become the most important part of everyone's life. You just punch it into Google and you get but this I think we need to really get away from. If we need to build sound understanding into the area of law, that rush for searching in Google should come down. It should be more on reliant on the methods that are used, the material that is being made available to our students so that they're able to take it well through the semester. A lot of surface learning is what I see a huge problem that we face currently. And not to really point any reference here, but it is just expected because we've got used to searching everything and finding out the answer. But then we have not been able to provide ourselves a very holistic understanding of any particular topic. Now, so therefore, bringing that context to students is very important. So engaging with the institution. If a student is staying back after the class hours, sitting in the library and studying, sitting with a teacher and discussing, sitting in a group and analyzing some critical arguments, that is a positive sign. So we need to see more and more of that happening when we look at institutions. So let me move into another context of where we are looking at bringing changes to curriculum. Now, there are institutions differ in the way which they revise curriculum. For instance, in our institution, every 3 years we revise the curriculum, but that's not the general standard. Sometimes we're revising subjects every year, sometimes even every semester. Now, when a leading judgment is coming out from the apex court, the next day that should be discussed in class. That's the right understanding, so that students are, in the current understanding of what's happening on the law. So another aspect that we need to also look at when we revise curriculum is to give the comparative perspective, because that is where student careers sometimes are also related to. A lot is happening on the policy considerations. So there also we need to understand how policies are being shaped. And of course, being able to understand industry standards and development of specialized skills. So where we look at the aspect of teaching law, we need to understand that does the subject balance the primary objective of the information package, that is the teaching in that subject, and to what extent the subject also caters to building the factors that are necessary in terms of student outcomes. Because if a student feels that beyond the class, if the student is very near ready or not to practice, that will be the fulcrum, I would believe, where we need to focus on. So somewhere we are looking at building that, bridging that particular gap, that a student, when he goes into the practice, more or less they're built to take on from day one. For this, the only way we can ever think of is to begin with the teacher. So a teacher is a lifelong student, as you would all appreciate. For a teacher, that is the biggest asset, and that is also the biggest difficulty. Because all of you would agree that we are not teaching a single subject, we are teaching multiple subjects. Being abreast with the current developments, trying to inculcate that into the curriculum is not an easy task for any teacher or for any head of the department, or let us say for any institution. But then that is the challenge that all of us have. So we need to be looking at capacity building from this context as well, of looking at the curriculum. Now, bringing the focus back into teaching IP subjects. We are not, this is actually, I would say, a slow process and a gradual process. Even today, you do not have teachers who are good at everything, right? That they also understand the economics of IP, they understand the technological aspects of IP, and they also understand the context of the law to the fullest extent. We do have now a core set of teachers who understand some of the interfaces. The way of building the interface, one easier way is cooperative teaching. But then this is where we need to look at how we can effectively blend technology and law, especially for subjects which are related to, corely related to this kind of a interface. So this is where teachers have to go an extra mile and the institutions should also facilitate. So I do know of, in the area of science, professors go abroad on a sabbatical. They stay there, another institution, for about 1 year or 6 months, gain experience and come back, do research. This kind of thing is quite usual in the science area and the technology area. Now, in the area of law, you have scholarships, which are more of an individual research nature, but they are not of the nature where you're actually spending time with another institution, whether in India or abroad, in order to blend that aspect of theory and practice. Another thing we need to look at, that is one thing from the long-term association. So for a person who is teaching, let us say, strategy in the area of IP, if you've never been with an industry, understanding corely what is strategy, you would nearly not be able to bring the real life experience into the class. You will be able to simulate from reading, but you will not be able to bring in the practice into the class. Also, as a teacher, if you have never filed for IP or you have never dealt with IP, then also it is difficult. So this is where the teacher is limited. The institution needs to support. The institution needs to facilitate. Why not faculty internships? Why not faculty internships? Why not faculty industry interface? See, industry come to academia, right? They come and take your courses. But why is it that faculty cannot interact with the industry? Can a faculty be given a short-term leave during the summertime where you can go and interact with the industry or with a practitioner or with a law firm? Understand what are the core aspects of that particular area. So this kind of a thing will help by bringing that experience into teaching. So today we need a clear blending of theory and practice because that is the need of the hour. The stakeholders who are your students are coming to your institution are having this expectation. So obviously we need to look at that context. So more and more we do that, more and more we are able to bring the real-time experience into the class. And I'm very sure no student will touch Google. So it's a challenge. And that expectation is quite genuine if that comes from the stakeholders. So this is something that we need to really look at from the institutional lens. Again, not sacrificing on the semester time, but trying to use the summer time or the winter time, or maybe, you know, institutions do offer sabbatical, and why not a part sabbatical into something like this will really help. So yes, that's what I was talking about, that institution has a wish list for you, that these are the things that, you know, would be good for the institution to attract a lot of stakeholders into it. Similarly, students, like students, teachers also need nourishment time. And this is where we need to appreciate that teachers, from my understanding, I would believe that every teacher would like to be very sincere with their subject, but there are limitations. That's quite genuine. So how can we help update a teacher's knowledge? How can we really help make a teacher be more versatile? That is where teacher training is very important. A faculty development program should look at this context of the outcome of the faculty development program should be into specific objectives of how each teacher is going to take forward this particular aspect. The area of digital learning also has challenges, because I can tell you that even we've had difficulties doing online classes. Keeping all students interested into the class is a big challenge in the digital time. So this is something looking at in the pandemic time, virtual classrooms, enhancing learning to that comes again with a lot of changes that we've also needed to incorporate. Coming specifically to faculty development programs, this is a very humble input that I would like this to be included, especially for a topic like this where we're looking at interdisciplinary knowledge into, you know, IP teaching. that this should lead to specific outcomes, where training of teachers happens with respect to the needs and expectations of the institution. How many of our faculty have already visited industry in their areas? Do we have faculty visiting fields? You're teaching land law. Have you dealt with land disputes? You're teaching agriculture law. Have you been able to understand at the ground level what are the core issues? This will be enabling to the teacher. And after all, the teacher is limited, as I told you. The institution should be looking at facilitating. So when you fill up a form on what are the semester requirements are not just subjects. They're also requirements of a teacher. We typically ask students, what are your requirements? But we do not ask our teachers, what are your requirements? I think it is time we need to really look at this aspect of it, because a teacher would like to also get trained. I'm telling you very humbly, there is no end to knowledge. The more you learn, you realize the more less you know. And that's the truth everywhere. So teacher training is a must, irrespective of age, qualification, and level, I would believe. No one is an expert in any area. We still have room to learn. And that's, I think, fundamentally what I would like to emphasize here, that we need to build that context even for the teacher. So I would be very happy if all of us are filling in up that these are the areas where we need to get trained. Back in 2008, I myself had given a set of suggestions that these are the areas that I would like to explore more. So that then, you know, what happens is it builds a lot of growth into teaching than in the traditional end. So I wanted to bring in another context into, you know, the capacity building of IP is IP research. Today, teaching and research go hand in hand. It is no longer teaching alone. I see, irrespective of whether the institutions have a full-fledged research program or not, you would appreciate that most people are also into serious research. Now, IP research is one which also builds a lot of good background into IP teaching. If a teacher is researching in the area, most likely the teacher will bring more practical insights into the subject. So this is where we are looking at just not core competency, but also, let's say you're working in the interface areas of IP and space, IP and competition law, IP and energy. You will be able to bring a lot of understanding from the allied discipline. So how does this help the institution? If a teacher is sound in the areas of research, most likely you're building the next tier of students. The research students, the doctoral students are built well into the area of IP. As you would agree with me that there is a dearth of teachers in the legal teaching area. We need to build good capacity. And so therefore, we need more and more doctoral students taking up these interdisciplinary areas to be able to become the next set of teachers in the country. So wherever we look at IP research, that outcome of the IP research helps flow through all the programs, the bachelor's program, the master's program, as well as the PhD program as well. So when we are growing these programs in our institution, we need to also not only build the teaching, we need to build the research as well. And today I can tell you, it is not about large institutions or small institutions. It's actually about good research. We need to grow the area of research. And I'm very sure the country has a lot of capability, which we still need to see. So that is where the area of IP research could help. So after 15 years of teaching IP law and also now continuing in the area, I have a few observations. Well, this is a theory of use and disuse. All of you know Lamarckian theory of use and disuse. I'm trying to apply it to teaching. The more you use the subject, the more you grow in that. The more you do not use the nuances of the basic understanding and the allied understanding, the more you are losing out into building teaching into the area. Then there's also this aspect of adaptation theory, right? So today, Students are also coming to an institution to build the additional knowledge or the interface knowledge with between different areas of law. So how quick the teacher can adapt to build that understanding is very important. And yes, I think the teachers are the best, I would believe, for survival skills. For a teacher, it is like, sometimes, I do speak to a lot of stakeholders, and then we do understand that because of the institutional requirements, suddenly over the next semester, you're being given, let us say, a new subject. But then that's the capacity that you have. You're a teacher. You're a teacher, remember that. You're sworn into this profession of teaching. I'm using the word sworn into this profession of teaching. So that is where our survival skill helps. So the quickest way in which you can adapt and develop this skill is the mark of a teacher. Down the lane, I'm very sure every stakeholder who has been a part of your class will understand the honesty with which you're actually dealing with that subject. And of course, comparative law, I mentioned to you, the most fascinating area of work that I've found so far. And it's quite challenging. Every day you're learning newer aspects. Sometimes we just don't deal with only 3 major jurisdictions. We tell them of maybe what's happening in Australia, maybe what's happening in China in terms of changes in law or in some other country. That sometimes helps to understand the interpretation of the different laws in different jurisdictions. So comparative approach is always good for students to build their career, especially in the areas of IP. So I would like to close this at this point of time, just to bring certain take-home messages when it comes to how to build interdisciplinarity into IP teaching and how to build effective IP research. Now, the first and fundamental thing for building capacity is readiness of a teacher to take up the interface areas. That's very important. So it's not just the readiness of a teacher, but it should also be a mandate of an institution. Because sometimes mandates drive positive outcomes. Now, in the second aspect of building capacity, the need to inculcate cooperative teaching is the most easiest that we can do at this point of time, and that should become also a mandate of every institution. So someone who is teaching cybersecurity would not be in a position, if they are a core law teacher, to give the nuances of what is an IP address and how an IP address is managed or modified or how it is configured. So this kind of a thing we need to look at. Cooperative teaching in the interim, and then long-term capacity building is an important requirement. That is where stakeholder interest is important, teacher interest is also important. So if the stakeholder interest says that a lot of people are actually moving into specific interface aspects of, let us say, intellectual property and competition law, then as a teacher should be ready to take on the understanding of competition law as well and bringing that into the class. Similarly, at the institution, at the department level, identifying these needs are important. So not taking feedback only from the students, you need to also look at taking feedback from teachers on how they fared and how they would like to move ahead in their teaching career. So this is something I would believe we need to look at. And I think the biggest challenge is for teachers. If you can gently blend theory with the understanding of socio-legal aspects, economic aspects, technology aspects, I think that is, I would believe that you're making a song, and every aspect of it would be very interesting. So it's like actually compositions, compositions are made on the basic understanding, but compositions also have a nuance. That nuance is something that you can bring into teaching. So building capacity into IP teaching, I would barely put that in that context. And all of us teachers will need to do research, because that will drive you to bring in a lot of interest into the subject. Students can work with you. Master students sometimes I've seen have done some great work. It's just not PhD students. Now at the PhD level also, if you do not do research, you will not be able to guide your own student. If you do field work, you will insist on field work for your student. And I'm telling you, in the initial end, the students will feel hesitant, because empirical work is something which is a few decades I would see only in the law area. Typically, it is more of doctrinal research, which is good. We need that. but we need to build more and more of empirical research in the legal context. Because then we are looking at another paradigm of the interpretation of the law, the impact of the law, the administrative mechanism that we're studying. So we need to see a lot of growth in the research also. So an institution should be able to balance a teacher's position, not only from the capacity into teaching, but also into research. And of course, interinstitutionally, I think a lot of growth can also be seen. So I think I would believe that we have the capacity in the country, and just that we need a quite focused and oriented way of looking at, because academic institutions have a lot of flexibility, but this flexibility itself can be a limitation that we have, where, well, it's okay if you do it that way. But sometimes we need to push ourselves an extra mile and say, well, it's not just okay for us to just go and teach. Are we bringing the understanding into the complex areas, the interdisciplinary areas is something that we need to constantly deliberate. That deliberation is not just at the teaching fraternity, please. It has to be at the institutional level as well. So with these few words, I would like to close my presentation and be ready to take any questions if you have. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for your mind-blowing session. And out of your busy schedule, it was really a lively session, madam. We have a very few questions, ma'am. Yes, yes. One participant. What is the role of World Intellectual Property Organization in assisting universities in creating networks of like-minded universities and educational institutions teaching IP?
Okay, I'll speak from generally what I'm aware. WIPO is an organization that is promoting the aspects of IP worldwide. Teaching is only one aspect of it. Now, WIPO has an academy which doles out a lot of courses in relation to IP. From what I understand is the WIPO Academy has a lot of teachers from different institutions across the world who run certain short-term as well as long-term programs, which people from across the world can actually take. And it's more of imparting specific IP, teaching, I would say, not seriously training. Now, WIPO does conduct a lot of summer schools across in different parts of the world. There has been a WIPO summer school also in India. There are times at which they do conduct in India. And they do accept a lot of participants into WIPO summer school. Then WIPO has also understanding with several patent offices like the EPO and many other offices, through which they also conduct a lot of training. That's where the training comes in. So if you look at the WIPO website, there are some of these programs which you may want to look at and see what is suitable for you. Okay. And that's one thing I would say. They also have their extended master's program and all of those also, which they run. So that's on the WIPO's thing.
Okay, ma'am. We have another question. Teaching IP involves certain level of technical concepts. So how to rope those students who do not have any kind of interest over those technological concepts?
Very good question. Very good question, yes. This is a challenge for the teacher, and you should live up to the challenge. Yes, those who do not have I'll tell you how students come from different perspectives, right? Some of them do not have the technology background. So you need to train them into it. Now I can tell you the very first batch of our students from the institution, they did an internship with the technology department. Yes. So yes, it is important for the student to understand, that part of the technology background. So for that, you don't need to do any online class, or go for a separate training. If you have another institution nearby, you may send your students there. Or if, let us say, you're a large university and law school is only one school, let them interact with the technology department. Let them interact with the science department. Say someone who is studying biotechnology law should understand biotechnology. How do you build that? The student is in the same institution. So after your work hours, go and interact with the researchers. Give explicit permission so that they can work under some other professor in another department, understanding the technology aspects. We do that. That's typically the case. So what happens is slowly you're beginning to get a understanding of the technology, and then also be able to, well, I can give you from my personal experience. I have a research student who doesn't come from a technology background and is dealing with cross jurisdictional comparative work in the area of AI, particularly dealing with drug regulation. So there are two things that I need to look at as a PhD supervisor. First is, do we understand AI? Now, initially 4 months, it was very tough for her. Very tough for her. It was not easy, let me tell you. After reading around 15 research papers, she was totally confused. What is this deep learning? What is this neural networks? Studying a technology definition may not be easy, even for us. Why only a student? It takes time. So build that understanding very early. So now I can tell you, when she spoke at her registration seminar, I was quite taken aback. I didn't expect that level of understanding. So that capacity can be built only over a series of, it's a time period. So you need to allow that to settle in well. Then she interacts with other departments. She gains an understanding. See, all of it, you can't get it within a day, right? So it takes time. So you need to build that. Either you do an internship, send them on field. Best way is to learn it on the field, right?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
So yeah.
Yes, ma'am. And another one question is, science background is necessarily required for teaching IP with reference to law institutions?
Science background desirable, I would say. Desirable. Reason being, if you do not understand the matters of fact, how would you apply the law? For instance, if you're looking at a claim in a patent document, a, a patent document is a techno-legal document. If you do not understand what is the invention, you will not be able to pick up the key features of the invention. If you're not able to pick up the key features of the invention, you will not understand how the claim is drafted. That's number one. Now, if you're not able to draft a claim well, there may be a strike on the patent for the novelty. That is, you have not ascertained the patentability of the invention. That's number one. If you're again not able to draft the claim well, as a lawyer, maybe you're infringing on an existing patent. You're drafting a claim for your client where there is a case of infringement that is imminently lying. So bringing it down to the understanding of the invention is the first critical thing. Law is only an application there. So you need to understand the law. You need to understand the fundamentals of law, but then you need to understand the matters of the fact as well. Now, let me tell you, even for a person from science or technology background who moves into the area of law, it's not easy because of the complexity. Here are your matters of fact, here are your matters of law which you're applying. That interdisciplinarity itself is very complex to understand. So you need to nurture it. That's the only way. No one is suddenly takes on and becomes an expert over it. It is built over time. So bringing that interdisciplinarity means you have to start ahead of time. As an institution, as a teacher, you have to start well ahead of time and continue to build that over a period of time. And yes, there are some ways of doing it, because one is the general understanding, building on that. Second is interacting with the science departments, engineering department, interacting with administrative agencies. I see some of them have put up a thing on the plant variety protection aspect of it. Now, I had a student who was working on the DUS testing and the effectiveness of DUS testing in the interface of technology and law. Because DUS testing is the one that you pay the largest cost in relation to the plant variety registration. So she necessarily had to go and intern with the plant variety protection, the authority in Delhi, and interact with that scientific group, which is dealing with that type of DUS testing. Build that understanding over a period of time, and then look at. So it takes a while. Yes, I agree. And you have to start early.
Ma'am, I have a last question with your permission.
Just to add, Devi, it is not impossible. That is all I would like to tell you. The marriage of technology and law, technologist into law, lawyer into technologist, both are possible. Both are possible. It is not impossible. That I can tell you.
Okay, ma'am. Shall I proceed with another question, ma'am? I have a last question, ma'am, with your permission. Ma'am, can you point out the importance of empirical research for IP field, and how could be effectively done on the emerging and allied IP regime like Plant Varieties and Protection Act?
Yeah. So empirical research helps you because it brings you the practical context of intellectual property law into the class. Again, when I say I have almost 15 years of teaching experience, I also have the same experience in relation to research in this area. For the very first student who joined the law school, the student joined from with a science background. Now you need to build that student into the research in IP law. So the first attempt was to build them in empirical research into this area. So how do you do that? Is you set the problems where you have the aspect of looking at implementation of the IP law from the context of, let us say, prosecution. Then you're looking at either the case-based understanding, or you're looking at the understanding of the patent office or the respective offices on how they are disposing cases. So I can tell you one example through an illustration of an example. There was a master's student who worked on the disposition of IP cases under the IPAB. Now, how do you look at disposition of IP cases under the IPAB at a time when no registers were available online? The only way to do that is to actually go down to Chennai, be with the IPAB, do the research there. So then when you look up the file, you understand the nuances of the disposition. See, it is easier to say this case was disposed late, this case was disposed early. What are the critical aspects? What are the challenges in dealing with that case? What actually happened in that case? Today it's available online for you, most of it. But in the days back then, nothing was available. And let me tell you, the only way this student gained on the understanding of how to dispose the cases, how the cases were disposed, is by doing empirical research on bringing out all those aspects of looking up each register. Let me tell you, each register, identifying the timelines. And that is the empirical work that is available as a publication. So how does that understanding build in the class? Then you're bringing into the class what actually happens on a case. The filing of a case to the disposition of a case is not just a straight-jacketed thing of how you study procedure under the law. Okay, it moves from this section to, it's not like that. Or you filled up this form and then you submit it. But there's a nuance to the entire thing of how cases move. So that is one example that I would like to cite. Another example is where you're looking at the interface area. So for instance, you're studying the aspect of where biotechnology research leads sometimes to inventions. And in India, if you have to file a patent application in relation to inventions coming out from the use of bioresources, you necessarily need a no objection from the Biodiversity Authority, where you have to sign up an ABS agreement ahead of the entire procedure, just to simply put it. Now, if a student is working on the interface of the biodiversity legislation and the patent legislation, and understanding what is happening in the interface of these two, when administrative authorities are not yet linked, mind you, there's a talk on the linking of it, but there's been no linking. The patent will not be sealed, even if it is examined, subject to the NOC that you get under Section 6 of the Biological Diversity Act 2002. So what are the challenges in working in this? The only way a student can get to know is actually interact with both the authorities, interact with the applicants, and why the applicants find it difficult on the disposition. Second thing is, what is the expert committee on ABS doing? When does the expert committee on ABS sit? Why the disposition is not happening? Similarly, if you're looking at the area of GI, also it's the same thing. How can you understand socio-economic aspects of GI if you're not working in the field? Socio-economic aspects of GI is not by looking at the GI registry of how many applications have been filed. No, it's not that. You have to go down to the field level. Suppose, let's say we want to understand the post-GI impact. You'll have to go to the field level to understand how the GI registration has actually impacted a particular sector. Same thing with plant variety protection. Here you're looking at the implementation of the Plant Variety Protection Farmer Rights Act 2001. When you're looking at the implementation, let's say largest number of farmer variety certificates have been given. What happened post that? Has that enabled any recognition to the farmers? That is one aspect of it. Now I talk to you about DUS testing. How is the DUS testing different for different types of plant varieties? For an horticulture crop, it is different. Who decides on this DUS testing? Some comes from the conventional, the UPOV. The UPOV also has developed only for certain crop varieties. Now, if you look at the Plant Variety Protection Authority website, there are a list of crop varieties for which DUS testing is available. What does that mean? That DUS testing standards have been developed with respect to that. How are these standards developed? Suppose, let us say, I have a proposition that why not use molecular markers? Then the question that comes as an important research objective is, how can molecular markers be incorporated into DUS testing mechanism? And what is the value that you will attach to a molecular marker from the point of view of interpretation under the law? So that means there is a traditional value that you're attaching to morphological characteristics, anatomical characteristics, but then now molecular markers. So suppose I include a molecular marker, will it become much easier to do DS testing? Now, let us say I've submitted a sample to the Plant Variety Protection Authority under DUS testing. I have given you the sample in a standard mode. That is, if this seed, if it is planted under that climate and under that conditions, will put up some few grains, that number of grains. Now, let us say the DUS testing is done and they report to you that the characteristic is not uniform. Now, as per the Act, the characteristic has to be uniform. Now, the uniformity is not at your end when you submitted the seed sample. The uniformity is not coming up maybe because of the testing. What are the options available for the applicant from the point of view of the law? Can you appeal to the authority that because of varied conditions? So when you're rejecting an application, on what basis you're rejecting? So what are the standard conditions? These are going to have a lot of bearing. So there is a substantive aspect which is going to have a lot of bearing on the procedural aspects of disposing an application. So if a student has to understand this, the only way is going down to the agriculture research station, understanding what are the local conditions, what are the limitations with which they work. Sometimes they have to ask the applicant for additional seed. Sometimes the crop fails. So these things can be done only by empirical work. In fact, I must tell you also, the students who are from those backgrounds also like to choose these kind of topics. I had a student who was from a botany background. He's now a very good lawyer who is from our law school. He took up the area of, and then of course, subsequently another student also took up. Yeah, so that's the only way. Empirical research is the only way.
Okay,
that builds you the practical understanding of the law. So law teaching is no longer about, okay, this section, that section, this is the substantive aspect, that is the procedural, this is the seminal case. Well, good, that's all good. No problem with that. We still need the leading cases. We still need to go back to all those, courts where we are invoking all of that. But then what about the practical understanding? Tomorrow, the student who is going to go into a career is day in and day out dealing with the authority. Day in and day out has to appear in the court. He has to represent the client. Are we building that understanding? For that, empirical research will support you from bringing that practical understanding.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. And I have a last question with your permission. How is IP and climate change studies related in the present global context?
Yeah, it's a big question, large question, I would say, broad one. But green technologies are an answer. Green technologies, green technologies are what? I mean, the name is green, but technologies which are sustainable and in support of mitigating climate change effects. How do you really look at this kind of research? This has several facets of it. You're looking at, that is where you're looking at what are the technologies available worldwide which actually mitigate climate change and which are more sustainable. That is, you're preparing the earth for not going into aberrations further. So that is where you would pitch for and most of those technologies are IP protected. Most of them are IP protected. There are very few which are actually left on the pledged out. but most of it is IP protected. Then the issue of technology transfer comes in. Then the issue of, again, balancing the how do, because if you really look at it, we are a biodiverse rich country, but we have a technology limitation because the developed countries are ahead in technology in these areas also. So that is where we need to look at sometimes a case of technology transfer, but sometimes in the interface of IP and climate change, local solutions are also very important. That means how many local technologies are developed which can actually also mitigate climate change. So that I would believe is the, I mean, if you can make the question more specific, I'd be very happy because it's too broad otherwise. Exactly, I'm not sure what you are trying to, but IP, when you talk about in generally, those are the technologies which is covered by IP, which are actually more about sustainability, more about mitigating the climate change effect, reduced emissions, electric vehicles, these kind of things. So wherever you see, but there are, most of them are covered by IP. It's not that IP is free and available for all to use. So,
I have another question, ma'am. Last, how are environmental law scholars do interdisciplinary research of intellectual property law and environment law?
this one example that we discussed earlier about green technologies. Are really green technologies contributing to mitigation of climate change? That's a question to ask. Generally, in that you can have a lot of subset questions that technologies developed in India, are they really sustainable for a better, are we going to be able to meet the SDG goals? Will it help in the country? Then how are these green technologies that are developed in India implemented? So developing a technology is only one facet of it. Are they implemented? When they implemented, the implementation mechanism works differently. Okay, so where is the policy push? Or let us say those who are working in the area of the interdisciplinary areas may be also looking at the aspect of how many IPs are pledged. Is there IP pooling? Do we need a pooling of technologies? This is one aspect that can be considered. And IP and biodiversity law. There's always been this constant thing between this aspect of Section 6, which is very, very specific to an Indian context. Section 6 of the Biological Diversity Act and mind you, Section 6 just not talks about only patent, IP. So far, we have not seen the interpretation of Section 6 in relation to other IP, but this is something that one can look at. So that is something which is possible. Then, of course, environmentally sustainable technologies and intellectual property. So how many we can say maybe how many industries are able to use sustainable technologies which are environment friendly. So green cover, there's so much being talked about green cover. Yes, another thing is about CSR, CER, corporate environmental responsibility. So there's a part of CSR, as you are aware, which provides for actually greenness, and you get credits on that, as a company. Now, how many companies are able to actually do that? And then how many companies are able to transfer technology to local context? See, I'm an industry developing technology, but is the neighboring area benefiting out of the technology that I've developed for greenness? That makes more sense, right? So some time back, we worked on bioenergy inventions. I have a small area of research which is on biofuels, and that's where we have examined the biofuel context and these solid biofuels, liquid biofuels, and all of these. But yes, that is also an interesting area to work with.
Last question, ma'am. Sorry. What is your view? What is your view on the standard essential patents in India? Do you think that it is violative of Competition Act 2002?
See, standard essential. See, let's see. Anyone who is approaching this subject has to understand certain things. One is the industry context. Second is the market context. From the industry standpoint, there are certain technologies which need to be bundled. Your mobile phone is an excellent example of that, right? All of you understand that, a lot of technologies are bundled into it. I'll try to keep the discussion very simple. I don't want to talk about what is the definition of a standard essential patent and things like that. So the imperative, as we see, wherever we are looking at bringing technology, is more and more moving into the context of the bundling of IP. That is, we are looking at not just one IP, a set of IP being implemented. Now here we are talking about a set of patents which are getting implemented into a device or into a use of a technology. Then those set of patents are basically underlying what are those? These are technologies. And those technologies are developed as standard technologies. They are standards developed by the industry, so they're standards normally. Now in that, whenever a standard is covered by a patent, it's a standard patent. We understand that very clearly. Now comes the context of standard essential patents. That is, what does it mean? That means for the implementation of the technology, let us say tomorrow I want to implement a 5G. For 5G, I need a series of technologies which are bare minimum. They are essential for the implementation of that standard. Now, those technologies which are essential are defined as a standard by the industry and also covered by the patents are nothing but standard essential patents from the very simplistic understanding. Okay. Now, why is SCP become a context of competition law? Now, Competition Commission is what? Competition Commission is a market regulator, right? Under the Competition Act. That is there to regulate the competition and make sure that there is no abuse of dominance. Dominance is okay. Abuse of dominance is a problem. All of us agree with that. Now, standard essential patents, how can they become anti-competitive? That is what is our interest, right? How can they become anti-competitive? Now, all of us understand anti-competitive behavior defined under Section 18 of the Competition Act, that there are various ways in which appreciable adverse effect can be identified. Simple understanding is that now you're an industry, you have an industry group. Now the industry group comes up with, let us say, a set of patents and say that, okay, to implement this standard, we need 10 patents. But you are not telling the market how those 10 patents are combined. What is the value of each of those patents? When you now license out that particular technology, you're licensing it as a bulk, right? As a bulk and one royalty. So where are the problems that come up? Royalty determination. All of you have heard of Rand and Frank. That's become a big debate around. How have you fixed the royalty? And the royalty should be non-discriminatory and it should be on fair and reasonable terms. Very easy to say the words, but much difficult. Why? Because the backing is technology. The industry is giving you that this is how much we have spent on the technology. Where is the verifiability? Do we have a verifiability for that? We only have what you call a near estimate. So the industry may set a standard, may have developed the standard at a much lower cost, but the royalty is much higher. That is one thing. Then you are actually, even if you keep national incomes on par, the pricing is in another country is way low compared to pricing in India. Even if you bring national incomes on par, that will be discriminatory pricing, right? Excessive pricing. All these can be a problem. So pricing is one part, royalties is one part, an issue which is you deal with the standard essential patents. Another important thing is information asymmetry. The Competition Commission, there's a public-private interface in these areas of law. I think you appreciate that. From the public use point of view, the more and more the transparency, the better it is, right, to the market, because market is certain. Now, how do you build uncertainty into the market? You build information asymmetry. If you don't have information asymmetry, why will someone come and take it from you? So you create that kind of an information asymmetry where that is also an abusive aspect of it. So if you're able to clearly tell this is what it is, that is what it is, that these are the patterns going into it, and this patent is contributing so and so into the technology, it is much easier. So the regulation is coming from the Competition Commission into bringing in more and more transparency into the entire use of technology, bundling of technology. From the industry point of view, there is also a difficulty. in terms of bundling together the technology, all the time they may not be able to determine some patents may be more important than some other patents. Then immediately the licensee will say, why would I pay for that third patent? I would pay only for the 2 patents. So the licensing rule. So there are challenges both ways. And certainly courts have been dealing with these matters where the courts, as you see in the Philips case, have come up with a lot of principles in relation to setting the notion of SEP. That is where the Competition Commission has been suggested to come up with specific guidance. Because what is the idea here? Courts are an important mechanism because courts come into where you need to be looking at building rules, implementing the law, interpretation of the law to the end of actually making things available to the public, in a very fair manner. So SEP will continue to become a crux of the thing. You have heard the recent case of Huawei case also across in the UK. So there are, of course, here you see public standard setting, you see private standard setting. Typically in the area of standard essential patents, it starts with private standard setting because industry first sets the standard. Then when it comes into the market, you see the market regulation coming up from Competition Commission. So there's always this tug of war, where the Competition Commission is trying to bring down the prices, trying to set the rules. Industry wants to enrich by, covering it with IP. So because it gives more exclusivity. And if industry does not have exclusivity, that's not an incentive for them to take forward the technology into the market. So they need to reap the benefits. So you will see this tug of war always between. So that's where I would see the context of standard essential patents. If you need to understand, first understand what is market, what drives competition in the market, what is anti-competitive behavior. Then look at IP as an exclusive right. IP also has this monopolistic nature that facilitates the thing. So where you see the cases falling in, there are a lot of cases across jurisdictions. So how do you see the principles laid down in a Motorola mobility case or any of these having effect in terms of the impact post in terms of licensing or in terms of standard setting bodies reorienting their policies, because courts have come out already with judgments and that's the law. I hope I'm able to address at least some part of your question. I know it's a very big question, but
Yes, ma'am, absolutely, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you so much for answering all the questions patiently, ma'am. We are really enlightened with your knowledge, ma'am. What we learn with pleasure, we never forget. This phrase is definitely applies on your lecture, ma'am. With the short notes, I invite our dear principal, madam, Professor Dr. Gaudi Ramesh, to deliver the vote of thanks. Madam, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Devi. Good morning to one and all present here. On behalf of the Directorate of Legal Studies and Chennai Dr. Ambedkar Government Law College, Pudupakkam, I extend my heartfelt thanks to our resource person, respected Professor Dr. Padmavati Manchikanti, for such an enriching session on interdisciplinary approach to IP law teaching, which is actually a trending topic in today's scenario. As already pointed out by Devi in her welcome speech, Madam is a pioneer in the field of IPR, which is a much sought after subject as of today. And we were fortunate enough to have her session last year also through virtual mode. Her quest in the field of IPR has made her adorn various administrative posts in the much acclaimed IIT Kharagpur institution. A special thanks to you, Madam, for accepting our invite and having graced the occasion with your in-depth knowledge and in-depth lecture, pinpointing the importance of the continuing learning process of the faculty members in comparison with the students, the dearth of the faculty members in the law field, and the ways and means of filling up that vacuum by learned, research-oriented teachers, and to top it off with all, the marriage between technology and law. And definitely a special thanks to Madam for the patient answering for all the last questions of Devi. I'm sure, Madam, our participants would have been greatly benefited by your erudite lecture and thereby strive to live up to the expectations of such an acclaimed academician like you, ma'am. Thank you once again, ma'am, and thank you all.
thank you all so much. Thank you very much. All the best.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. All the best to all of you. It's been pleasure to be with all of you, and all my best wishes to all of you and the participants. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you,
you,
ma'am. Thank you so much. Warm greetings and blessings.